The envelope arrived at Margaret's door 3 days after Henry's funeral, delivered by a lawyer she had never met, and the moment she saw her family name embossed on the firm's letterhead, she felt something cold settle in her stomach, because wealthy families didn't send lawyers to the homes of their deceased staff unless there were complications, unless there were claims being made or secrets being exposed that required legal management. Henry Sullivan had been the Ashford family butler for 30 years, had served her parents and then her and her brothers with a devotion that had seemed almost otherworldly, had been present for every major family moment, from weddings to funerals to the quiet everyday rituals that defined their privileged existence. And when he died suddenly of a stroke at 75, Margaret had mourned him genuinely, had paid for his funeral, and had delivered a eulogy that celebrated his loyalty and his dignity and his place in their family history. But now, standing in her foyer holding this envelope with trembling hands, Margaret understood with a certainty that made her knees weak that Henry had left something behind, had documented something during those 30 years of silent service, and that whatever was in this envelope would shatter the carefully constructed mythology the Ashford family had built around themselves, would prove that the man who had served them so faithfully had seen things they thought were hidden, had known truths they believed were secret, and had chosen to reveal those truths only after death, when he could no longer be punished for his honesty. Margaret Ashford had grown up in a world where people like Henry Sullivan were simply part of the landscape, staff who appeared when needed and disappeared when their services were complete, individuals who existed to maintain the smooth operation of wealthy households, but who were never quite seen as fully human, never quite acknowledged as people with their own stories and their own perspectives on the families they served. Henry had been hired by her father Richard in 1993 when Margaret was 15, brought in to replace the aging butler who had served the previous generation, and she remembered him arriving as a man in his mid-40s, impeccably dressed in the traditional black suit and white gloves, speaking with the slight Irish accent that marked him as someone who had learned service in the old country, where such traditions were still taken seriously. The Ashford family had been wealthy for 3 generations, her grandfather having built a pharmaceutical empire in the 1950s that her father had expanded into medical devices and hospital supplies, and by the time Margaret was born, the family name was synonymous with healthcare industry success and the kind of old money that came with expectations about behavior and reputation and maintaining appearances. They lived in a mansion on 10 acres outside the city, the kind of estate that required substantial staff to maintain, and Henry had been the anchor of that staff, the one who coordinated the maids and the groundskeepers and the cook, who made sure everything ran smoothly so that Richard and his wife Victoria could focus on their business and social obligations without being bothered by domestic details. Margaret had 3 siblings: her older brother Christopher, who was being groomed to take over the family business, her younger brother Thomas, who had been the rebellious one, and her sister Caroline, who had been the golden child, beautiful and charming and destined to marry well and produce the next generation of Ashfords. The 4 children had been raised with a strange combination of privilege and pressure, given everything money could buy, but also burdened with expectations about achievement and status and proper behavior, taught that the Ashford name meant something and that they had obligations to uphold the reputation their grandfather had built. Henry had been present for all of it, had served meals and answered doors and managed the household through Margaret's teenage years and her father's business expansion and her mother's increasingly problematic drinking and the various crises that families experienced even when they had enough money to usually insulate themselves from consequences. He had been there when Christopher married badly the first time and divorced expensively, when Thomas got arrested for drug possession and Richard had to use his connections to make the charges disappear, when Caroline's perfect marriage revealed itself to be covering her husband's affairs and her own growing dependence on prescription pills, and when Margaret herself had struggled through a depression that her parents had insisted she hide from everyone outside the family. Through all of this, Henry had maintained his professional distance, had performed his duties with the kind of discretion that wealthy families paid for, had never commented on what he witnessed or offered opinions about family matters, had simply been present and efficient, and seemingly content with his role as the person who made sure the Ashford household operated smoothly. Margaret had rarely thought about what Henry might actually think about their family, about whether he judged them or pitied them or simply viewed them as employers whose personal lives were none of his concern, and she realized now with a sick feeling that this lack of curiosity had been a kind of willful blindness, a refusal to acknowledge that Henry was a full person who observed and processed and remembered everything he saw. Her father, Richard, had died 5 years ago, a heart attack at 70 that had been sudden and had left the family scrambling to manage the business transition and the estate settlement. And Henry had been there through that crisis too, had managed the funeral arrangements and the reception afterward, and had somehow kept the household functioning while the family dealt with grief and lawyers and the complicated process of transferring wealth and power. Victoria, Margaret's mother, had retreated into her alcoholism after Richard's death, had become increasingly dependent on Henry to manage daily life, and he had done so with the same quiet competence he brought to everything, had made sure she was fed and that her medications were managed, and that the house remained presentable even as Victoria's engagement with the world decreased. Victoria had died 2 years ago, cirrhosis finally claiming her after decades of drinking that everyone had politely ignored, and the siblings had inherited the estate equally, had decided to keep the house rather than selling it, using it for family gatherings and as a place any of them could stay when they were in town. Henry had continued living there as the caretaker, maintaining the property with the help of a reduced staff, and the siblings had paid him generously and had assumed he would work until he was ready to retire, had never imagined he might die suddenly, that he might have a stroke while preparing breakfast one morning and be found by the housekeeper an hour later already gone. Margaret had been the one to handle the funeral arrangements, had felt it was appropriate given Henry's 3 decades of service to the family, and she had been surprised by how many people attended, how many other families Henry had apparently maintained relationships with over the years, people who spoke about him with genuine affection and respect, rather than the distant appreciation wealthy employers usually expressed about good staff. She had learned things at the funeral she hadn't known, that Henry had been supporting a sister back in Ireland who had health problems, that he had been quietly mentoring young men from his parish who were interested in hospitality careers, that he had been a person with a full life beyond his service to the Ashfords. The guilt Margaret felt about this ignorance had been sharp and immediate, the recognition that she had employed someone for 30 years without really knowing them, without caring to know them beyond their function in maintaining her family's comfort. She had delivered a eulogy that she hoped honored Henry properly, had talked about his dedication and his professionalism and the way he had been a constant presence through the family's various transitions. But her words had felt inadequate, had seemed to reduce a complex human being to his utility, and she had left the funeral feeling like she had failed Henry in death, as she had probably failed him in life, by never seeing him fully. And now this envelope, delivered 3 days after she had buried a man, she realized she had never really known, and Margaret stood in the foyer where Henry had greeted thousands of guests over 3 decades, and she felt afraid to open it, afraid of what truths it might contain, what observations Henry had recorded during years of watching the Ashford family when they thought they weren't being watched. She thought about calling her brothers and sister, about opening the envelope together so they could face whatever revelations it contained as a united front, but something stopped her, some instinct that this was meant for her specifically, that whatever Henry had documented was her responsibility to receive first. Margaret moved to her father's study, the room where Richard had made the decisions that built and maintained the family fortune, and she sat in his leather chair and opened the envelope with hands that wouldn't quite steady. Inside were several pages in Henry's neat handwriting, the same precise script she had seen on shopping lists and phone messages, and clipped to the pages was a flash drive and a note explaining that the drive contained additional documentation, photographs and recordings that supported what Henry had written. Margaret's stomach turned as she read this, because it meant Henry had been collecting evidence, had been building a case of some kind, and she couldn't imagine what would have motivated their loyal butler to become their secret archivist. The letter began with an apology, Henry writing that he had struggled for years with whether to reveal what he knew, had been torn between loyalty to the family that employed him and loyalty to truth and justice, and that he had ultimately decided that some secrets were too damaging to stay buried, that silence in the face of wrongdoing was its own form of complicity. He wrote that he had respected the Ashford family in many ways, had appreciated their generosity with his salary and their general courtesy in daily interactions, but that respect and courtesy did not erase moral obligations, did not excuse him from speaking up when he had witnessed things that were not just private family matters, but actual crimes, actual harm being done to people who had no power to defend themselves. Margaret felt her mouth go dry as she read this introduction, felt the room spinning slightly, and she forced herself to continue reading even though every instinct told her to stop, to burn the letter unread, to pretend Henry had left nothing behind but memories of faithful service. But she kept reading, and Henry's first revelation was about her brother Thomas, about the incident that had resulted in his arrest for drug possession that their father had made disappear through connections and money. Henry wrote that the official story, the one the family told themselves, was that Thomas had been holding drugs for a friend, that it had been a one-time mistake by a young man who had gotten mixed up with the wrong crowd, but that this story was a lie designed to protect Thomas and the family reputation. Henry explained that he had been present the night before Thomas's arrest, had overheard a conversation between Thomas and a young woman named Jennifer Hayes, who worked as a waitress at a restaurant the Ashford family frequented, and Thomas had been angry with Jennifer, had been accusing her of trying to blackmail him, had been threatening her with legal action and with using his family's resources to destroy her life. Henry had listened from the hallway outside Thomas's room, had heard Thomas admit that he had gotten Jennifer pregnant, that he had given her money for an abortion, but that Jennifer had decided to keep the baby and was now asking for child support. And Thomas had been telling her that he would never acknowledge the child, would deny paternity if she tried to pursue legal claims, and would make sure she regretted trying to extract money from an Ashford. The letter continued with Henry explaining that Jennifer had left that night visibly upset, and that the next day Thomas had been arrested with drugs in his car, drugs that Henry believed Thomas had planted in Jennifer's vehicle, and that had somehow ended up as evidence against Thomas instead, though Henry suspected the arrest had been orchestrated by Richard, who had gotten wind of the pregnancy situation and had decided that a drug charge that could be made to disappear was preferable to a paternity claim that would be harder to manage. Henry wrote that Jennifer had died 3 years later in a car accident, that she had been raising her son alone and struggling financially, and that her death had been ruled accidental, but Henry had always wondered whether it had really been coincidence, or whether someone had decided that eliminating the problem permanently was easier than dealing with ongoing child support claims. Margaret set the pages down because her hands were shaking too badly to hold them, because the implications of what Henry was saying were too enormous to process, and she thought about Thomas, who was now 42 and married with children of his own, who had apparently spent the last 25 years living with the knowledge that he had a son he had refused to acknowledge, a child whose mother had died young and who had presumably grown up in the foster system or with relatives, while Thomas enjoyed his inheritance and his comfortable life. The cruelty of it was staggering, the selfishness, and Margaret felt sick thinking about her brother and about her father, who had apparently been willing to orchestrate false arrests to protect the family reputation. But Henry's letter indicated this was just the first revelation, that there was more, that the flash drive contained documentation of other incidents over 30 years. And Margaret knew she had to keep reading, had to understand the full scope of what Henry had witnessed and recorded, had to face whatever truths would emerge, even if those truths destroyed her understanding of her family and her own place in the Ashford story. Before the story continues, tell me in the comments, do you think the butler was right to expose the family's secrets after 30 years of loyal service, or should he have taken these secrets to his grave? I need to know what you're thinking. And if you want to find out what else the butler documented, subscribe now, because this story gets darker than you can imagine, and I want you here when the full truth comes out. Margaret forced herself to continue reading, her heart pounding as Henry's letter moved to the second revelation, this one about her sister Caroline, who had always been presented as the perfect daughter, the one who had married a successful attorney named Bradley Morrison and who had produced 3 beautiful grandchildren for Victoria to dote on before her death. Henry wrote that Caroline's marriage had been troubled from the beginning, that Bradley had been controlling and emotionally abusive, that he had isolated Caroline from her friends and had monitored her spending and her activities, and that Caroline had confided in Henry on several occasions about wanting to leave but feeling trapped by financial dependence and by fear of what divorce would mean for her social standing. But Henry's letter revealed something darker that Margaret had never suspected, writing that Bradley's abuse had not been limited to emotional manipulation, that there had been physical violence that Caroline had hidden carefully, that Henry had seen bruises and had heard arguments through closed doors that had ended with sounds that suggested physical confrontation. Henry wrote that he had tried to encourage Caroline to seek help, had offered to testify on her behalf if she chose to leave, but that Caroline had been terrified of her father's reaction, had been convinced that Richard would side with Bradley because of business connections between the Ashford pharmaceutical empire and Bradley's law firm that represented several of their corporate interests. The letter explained that Richard had indeed known about the abuse, that Caroline had finally gathered the courage to tell him, hoping for support, and that Richard had advised her to make the marriage work, had told her that divorce would be scandalous and would affect the family's reputation, and that she needed to be more accommodating to her husband's needs and less demanding of his time and attention. Henry had overheard this conversation and had been horrified by Richard's response, by the way he had prioritized business relationships and social appearances over his daughter's safety, and Henry had watched Caroline retreat back into her marriage with a resignation that had been heartbreaking to witness. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face as she read this, because she had known Caroline's marriage was difficult, but had never understood the full scope of what her sister had endured, and she thought about all the family dinners where Caroline had smiled and had played the role of the perfect wife while apparently suffering abuse that their father had known about and had chosen to ignore. The guilt was overwhelming, the recognition that she could have done something if she had paid attention, if she had asked questions, if she had prioritized her sister's well-being over maintaining family harmony, but instead she had been complicit through ignorance and through her own investment in preserving the Ashford reputation. Henry's letter moved to Christopher next, Margaret's older brother, who had taken over the family business after Richard's death and who presented himself as a responsible executive carrying on their father's legacy. Henry wrote that Christopher had been embezzling from the company for years, that he had created shell corporations and fake vendors, and had been systematically siphoning money from the business into personal accounts, and that Richard had discovered this theft shortly before his death, but had covered it up rather than exposing Christopher and damaging the company's reputation and stock price. The letter explained that Richard had confronted Christopher privately, had demanded he stop the embezzlement, and had restructured the company finances to make it harder to continue, but had not reported the theft to the board or to authorities, had not demanded repayment, had simply made Christopher promise to stop, and had trusted that threat of disinheritance would be sufficient motivation. Henry had discovered this through documents left carelessly in Richard's study, had seen the evidence of Christopher's theft and Richard's cover-up, and had been appalled by the hypocrisy of a family that preached integrity and proper behavior while actively concealing crimes committed by their own members. But Henry wrote that Christopher had not stopped stealing, that after Richard's death Christopher had found new ways to extract money from the business, and that the current financial health of the Ashford pharmaceutical empire was not as strong as the public report suggested, that Christopher's theft over the years had amounted to tens of millions of dollars that had been hidden through creative accounting, and that would eventually be discovered either through audit or through business collapse when the missing funds could no longer be concealed. Henry had documented all of this, had kept copies of financial records and emails and bank statements that proved the systematic theft, and he had left this evidence for Margaret because he believed she was the only one of the siblings who might actually care more about truth than about protecting Christopher or preserving the illusion of family success. Margaret felt physically ill reading about Christopher's theft, about their father's complicity in covering it up, about the fact that the family business their grandfather had built was apparently being looted by Christopher while everyone pretended everything was fine. She thought about the employees who depended on the company for their livelihoods, the shareholders who had invested based on false financial reports, the community institutions that received donations from the Ashford Foundation that was apparently funded partially by stolen money, and she felt the weight of moral responsibility pressing down on her like something solid and suffocating. But Henry's letter wasn't finished, had one more revelation that he described as the worst, the one that had ultimately convinced him that silence was not an option, that documentation and exposure after his death was the only way to prevent ongoing harm. He wrote about Margaret herself, about something she had done that she thought no one knew about, something she had spent 15 years trying to forget, and Margaret's hands started shaking again as she realized Henry had witnessed the incident that was her deepest shame, the moment that had broken something in her that had never quite healed. Henry wrote that in 2008, when Margaret was 30, she had been driving home from a charity event late at night, had been drinking more than she should have, but had felt capable of driving the short distance from the country club to the estate, and she had struck a pedestrian on the dark road that led to the family property. Henry wrote that he had been awakened by the sound of Margaret's car in the driveway, had heard her sobbing, had come down to find her in shock explaining what had happened, and he had called Richard, who had arrived within minutes and had taken control of the situation with the kind of efficiency that suggested this was not the first time he had managed a crisis for one of his children. The letter explained that Richard had driven back to the accident scene with Henry, had found the body of a young man later identified as Daniel Cooper, a 23-year-old construction worker who had been walking home after his shift, and Richard had made a decision that Henry had argued against but had been powerless to prevent. Richard had moved the body to make it look like Daniel had been hit by a different vehicle, had placed evidence suggesting the hit and run had occurred further down the road, and had used his connections with local police to ensure the investigation went in directions that wouldn't lead back to Margaret or to the Ashford family. Henry wrote that he had been horrified by this cover-up, had wanted to insist that Margaret turn herself in and face consequences for her actions, but that Richard had threatened to fire him and to destroy his reputation if he spoke to anyone about what had happened, and Henry had been afraid, had needed his job, and had worried about what Richard's wealth and connections could do to him if he became an enemy rather than a trusted employee. So Henry had stayed silent, had watched the investigation conclude with no arrests, and with Daniel Cooper's family receiving no justice and no answers about what had happened to their son, and Henry had carried the guilt of that silence for 15 years while watching Margaret continue her life as if nothing had happened. Margaret felt like she couldn't breathe, felt like the room was closing in around her, because this was the truth she had never spoken aloud to anyone except her father and Henry on that terrible night. the truth that haunted her dreams and that had shaped every decision she had made for 15 years. She had killed someone, had taken a young man's life through carelessness and cowardice, and her father had made it disappear the way he had made all their problems disappear, through money and connections and a complete disregard for justice when justice threatened family interests. Henry's letter explained that he had kept copies of everything from that night, had documented the cover-up, had maintained contact with Daniel Cooper's mother, Ellen, who had spent 15 years searching for answers about what had happened to her son, and that Henry had left all of this evidence for Margaret, along with a plea that she finally do the right thing, that she turn herself in and give Ellen Cooper the truth and the justice that had been denied for so long. He wrote that he understood this would destroy Margaret's life, would result in prison time and public shame and the complete collapse of her social standing, but that these consequences were deserved, that Daniel Cooper's death demanded accountability, and that living with hidden guilt for 15 years had already destroyed something essential in Margaret's character that might possibly be recovered through confession and atonement. The letter concluded with Henry writing that he had loved the Ashford family in complicated ways, had genuinely cared about them as individuals, even while being appalled by their collective willingness to prioritize reputation over morality, and that he hoped his documentation of their secrets would not be seen as betrayal, but as the ultimate act of service, an attempt to force them to confront truths they had been avoiding and to become better people than they had allowed themselves to be, while Richard was alive to enable their worst impulses. Henry wrote that he had waited until after his death to reveal these things because he had been afraid while alive, had been dependent on their employment, and had worried about retaliation, but that death had freed him to speak truth, regardless of consequences, and he hoped Margaret and her siblings would find the courage to use his documentation to repair some of the harm their family had caused. Margaret sat in her father's study for hours after finishing the letter, the pages spread across the desk along with the flash drive she hadn't yet had the courage to examine, and she thought about Henry Sullivan, who had served them faithfully for 30 years while secretly documenting their crimes and their moral failures, and she tried to understand what combination of loyalty and disgust and sense of justice had motivated him to create this record. She thought about the choice he was offering her, to either expose everything he had documented and face the consequences, or to destroy the evidence and continue living with secrets that apparently Henry had found unbearable to carry alone. Her phone buzzed with texts from Christopher asking about some family business matter, from Caroline asking if they could meet for lunch next week, from Thomas sending a funny meme with no awareness that Henry had documented his abandoned son and the suspicious circumstances of Jennifer Hayes's death. Margaret looked at these messages from her siblings and felt a distance opening between them, felt like she was suddenly seeing them clearly for the first time, seeing not just the polished surfaces they presented, but the rot underneath, the casual cruelties and the crimes that their wealth had allowed them to commit without consequences. She thought about Daniel Cooper's mother, Ellen, who was still alive according to Henry's letter, still searching for answers about what had happened to her son 15 years ago, and Margaret imagined showing up at this woman's door and telling her the truth, confessing that she had killed Daniel while driving drunk and that her father had covered it up, and she couldn't envision any scenario where this confession led to anything other than destruction, prison time, and public scandal, and the complete collapse of everything she had built her identity around. But she also couldn't envision continuing to live with this secret now that Henry had forced her to confront it directly, now that she knew someone else had known all along and had found her silence intolerable enough to document it for potential exposure. Margaret made a decision then, made it sitting in her father's study, surrounded by the evidence of her family's corruption, and she called her siblings and told them they needed to meet immediately, that something had happened that required all of them to be together, and she heard the confusion in their voices, but also the automatic compliance, the lifetime of family loyalty that made them respond when an Ashford demanded their presence. She didn't tell them what it was about, didn't explain about Henry's letter, just said it was urgent and that they needed to come to the estate as soon as possible. And after she hung up, she sat holding the letter and the flash drive, and she tried to prepare herself for the conversation that would either begin the process of repairing the harm her family had caused, or would reveal that her siblings were too invested in their lies to allow truth to emerge, even when confronted with documentation of their crimes. Christopher arrived first, driving up in his Mercedes an hour after Margaret's call, and she could see the irritation on his face as he walked into the study, clearly annoyed at being summoned without explanation, probably assuming this was about some minor estate matter that could have been handled over the phone. He started to ask what was so urgent, but stopped when he saw Margaret's face, saw the pages spread across their father's desk, and the hollow expression in her eyes that suggested something fundamental had shifted, and his irritation transformed into wariness, into the defensive posture of someone who sensed they were about to be accused of something. Thomas came next, arriving in the Porsche he had bought with money from the trust fund their father had established, and he entered the study with the casual confidence of someone who had spent his life having problems solved for him, who had never faced real consequences for any of his actions. Caroline was last, and Margaret saw immediately that her sister had been crying, that something about the urgency in Margaret's voice had triggered anxiety, and Caroline looked fragile in ways that made Margaret want to hug her and also want to shake her for staying in a marriage that was destroying her. Margaret waited until all three siblings were seated, waited until their expectant faces were focused on her, and then she told them about Henry's letter, about the envelope that had arrived 3 days after his funeral, and she watched their expressions change as they began to understand that this was not a minor estate matter, but something that threatened everything they thought was secure and hidden. Christopher's face went pale and then flushed with anger. Thomas looked confused and then defensive, and Caroline started crying harder, apparently understanding immediately what Henry might have documented about her marriage and their father's response to her pleas for help. Margaret began by reading them the section about Thomas, about Jennifer Hayes and the child he had abandoned, and the suspicious circumstances of Jennifer's death, and Thomas erupted immediately, said this was bullshit, that Henry had obviously been senile or vindictive, that he had never gotten anyone pregnant, and certainly had never done anything that would result in someone's death. But his protests were too loud and too aggressive, the reaction of someone who had been caught rather than someone who had been falsely accused, and Margaret saw Christopher and Caroline looking at him with expressions that suggested they were calculating whether this revelation could damage them, whether Thomas's sins would contaminate the whole family or could be isolated and managed. Thomas demanded to see the letter, snatched it from Margaret's hands and read through Henry's account, and his face transformed from angry denial to something more calculating as he realized the implications. He said that even if any of this was true, which he wasn't admitting, it was ancient history, that the statute of limitations had run out, that there was no legal exposure and therefore no reason to do anything about it. He suggested they destroy the letter and whatever other documentation Henry had left, that they simply pretend this had never happened, that Henry had been a faithful servant who had taken whatever delusions he had to his grave. Margaret felt disgust rising in her throat listening to Thomas, understanding that he was more concerned about managing potential consequences than about the fact that he had a son somewhere who had grown up without a father, that Jennifer Hayes had died young and alone, that their father had apparently been willing to orchestrate false arrests and, maybe worse, to protect the family reputation. She told Thomas about the flash drive, about Henry's note that there was additional documentation, and Thomas's face went white as he realized that whatever evidence existed couldn't be simply denied or dismissed, that Henry had apparently been thorough in his record-keeping. Christopher interrupted then, his voice tight with controlled fury, and he said that Henry had been a spy and a traitor, that they had employed him generously for 30 years, and this was how he repaid their kindness, by secretly documenting their private matters and threatening to expose family business that was none of his concern. He said they needed to hire lawyers immediately, needed to figure out if Henry had shared this information communication with anyone else, whether there were copies that could emerge, whether they needed to prepare for potential legal action or media exposure. Christopher's approach was entirely defensive, entirely about damage control, and Margaret realized that he wasn't shocked by what Henry had documented about him because he knew it was true, knew he had been stealing from the family business, and was simply calculating how to prevent that truth from becoming public. Margaret told them about Henry's documentation of Christopher's embezzlement, read the sections of the letter that detailed the theft and their father's cover-up, and Christopher's fury intensified, his face flushing dark red as he insisted this was ridiculous, that Henry had obviously misunderstood normal business transactions, that moving money between accounts and creating subsidiaries was standard corporate practice and not theft. But his explanations were too elaborate and too defensive, and Margaret saw Caroline looking at her older brother with an expression that suggested she was re-evaluating everything she thought she knew about him, questioning whether the family business they all depended on was actually as solid as Christopher had always claimed. Then Margaret told them about Caroline, about Henry's documentation of Bradley's abuse and Richard's response, and Caroline's crying became sobs that shook her whole body, and she said she couldn't believe Henry had known, couldn't believe he had been watching her suffer and had done nothing, had just stood by while her husband hurt her and while her father told her to endure it for the sake of family reputation. Margaret tried to explain that Henry had offered to help, that he had wanted to testify on Caroline's behalf if she chose to leave, but Caroline just shook her head and said that none of them had helped her, that they had all known something was wrong and had all chosen to pretend everything was fine because addressing it would have been uncomfortable. The accusation hung in the air, and Margaret felt its weight, because Caroline was right. They had all failed her, had all prioritized their own comfort and the family's image over Caroline's safety and well-being, and Henry's documentation was evidence of that collective moral failure. Thomas actually had the audacity to suggest that Caroline was being dramatic, that lots of marriages were difficult, and that didn't mean she needed to make a big deal about it. And Caroline turned on him with a fury Margaret had never seen from her sister, told him to shut up, told him he knew nothing about what she had endured, told him that he had no right to minimize her pain when he had abandoned his own child and had let that child's mother die without ever acknowledging his responsibility. The siblings began arguing then, voices rising and accusations flying, years of resentment and hidden judgment emerging now that Henry's letter had cracked open the facade of family unity they had all been maintaining. Christopher accused Thomas of being a reckless fool whose behavior had always threatened the family. Thomas accused Christopher of being a thief and a hypocrite, and Caroline accused both of them of being selfish monsters who cared only about themselves. And through it all, Margaret sat silent, waiting for the right moment to tell them the last revelation, the one about herself that was worse than anything Henry had documented about her siblings. When the argument finally died down into hostile silence, Margaret told them about Daniel Cooper, about the hit and run in 2008 and their father's cover-up, and the room went completely quiet as her siblings processed this information. She explained what Henry had written, about the evidence he had kept, about Daniel's mother Ellen, who was still searching for answers, and she told them that Henry had specifically asked her to turn herself in, to give Ellen Cooper the justice that had been denied for 15 years, and that she was considering doing exactly that, regardless of what it would cost her. Christopher erupted at this, said she was insane if she was thinking about confessing to a 15-year-old accident, that there was no legal requirement to do so, that statute of limitations had probably run on whatever charges could have been filed, and that voluntarily destroying her life and the family reputation over something that couldn't be changed or fixed was the height of stupidity. He said that if she felt guilty, she could anonymously send money to Ellen Cooper, could make sure the woman was financially comfortable, but that confession served no purpose except making Margaret feel better about herself at everyone else's expense. Thomas agreed, said that Henry had obviously been mentally unstable, that documenting all of this and leaving it for them to find after his death was the act of someone with a grudge or delusions, and that they should disregard everything in the letter and continue with their lives as if this had never happened. He said they should destroy the flash drive without looking at it, should burn the letter, should simply move forward and let Henry's vindictive final act die with him. And Margaret saw that her brothers were united in their determination to suppress the truth, to continue the pattern their father had established of making problems disappear through denial and cover-up. But Caroline surprised everyone by speaking up, her voice still shaky but determined, and she said that maybe Henry was right, that maybe they needed to face what they had done, that living with these secrets was destroying them all in different ways, and that confession might be painful, but continuing to hide might be worse. She said she was thinking about leaving Bradley, about finally getting away from him, regardless of what their father would have wanted, and that if Margaret was brave enough to confess to something that would put her in prison, then Caroline could be brave enough to file for divorce and to tell the truth about why her marriage had failed. Christopher told Caroline she was being hysterical, that divorce was one thing, but Margaret confessing to vehicular manslaughter was something else entirely, that they needed to think about the family business and the Ashford reputation and the employees and shareholders who depended on them, and that individual guilt feelings couldn't justify destroying all of that. He said he would fight any attempt by Margaret to go public with Henry's documentation, would use legal means to prevent her from accessing the flash drive or sharing the letter, and that she needed to understand that protecting the family was more important than individual consciences. Margaret felt something hardening in her as she listened to Christopher, felt a determination forming that was stronger than her fear, and she told him that he didn't control her, that the evidence was already in her possession, and that she was going to spend the next few days reviewing everything Henry had documented and deciding what to do with it. She said that Henry had been right, that their father had enabled their worst impulses, had taught them that wealth and reputation mattered more than truth or justice, and that she was done living according to those values, done prioritizing image over integrity. Christopher stood up, his face dark with anger, and he told Margaret that if she did anything to damage the family or the business, he would make sure she regretted it, would use every legal tool available to destroy her financially and personally, and that she needed to think very carefully about whether her guilt was worth sacrificing everything their grandfather and father had built. Margaret met his eyes and said that maybe what their grandfather and father had built deserved to be torn down if it was founded on cover-ups and crime, and that she wasn't afraid of Christopher's threats, wasn't going to be bullied into continuing to hide truths that Henry had found too important to stay buried. Thomas tried to play peacemaker then, suggested they all take a few days to calm down before making any decisions, that they were emotional and needed time to process Henry's revelations. But Margaret shook her head and said she didn't need time, that she had already had 15 years to think about Daniel Cooper and what she owed his family, and that Henry's letter had simply forced her to finally confront what she had been avoiding. She told them they could each decide what to do about their own secrets, about Thomas's abandoned son and Christopher's theft and Caroline's abuse, but that she was making her own decisions about what she had done and what justice required. Caroline asked quietly what Margaret was going to do, whether she was really going to turn herself in, and Margaret said honestly that she didn't know yet, that she needed to look at whatever additional evidence Henry had left, needed to try to contact Ellen Cooper and understand what that woman needed, and that she was going to make decisions based on what was right rather than what was convenient. She said that Henry had served them faithfully for 30 years, and his final act had been to try to save them from themselves, to force them to confront truths they had been avoiding, and that she owed it to Henry's memory and to her own conscience to at least consider his perspective rather than immediately retreating into the defensive patterns their father had taught them. The meeting ended badly, Christopher storming out and threatening legal action, Thomas leaving with barely concealed disgust, and Caroline staying behind to hug Margaret and to whisper that she supported whatever Margaret decided to do, that she understood the weight of carrying secrets that destroyed you from the inside. After her siblings left, Margaret sat alone in her father's study, holding Henry's letter and the flash drive, and she thought about the butler who had watched them all for 30 years, who had seen their best and worst moments, who had been present but invisible in the the way that servants were supposed to be, and who had ultimately decided that bearing witness required more than just observation, required documentation and eventual revelation, regardless of personal cost. She inserted the flash drive into her father's computer with hands that trembled, and she began reviewing the files Henry had compiled, hundreds of photographs and recordings and documents that painted a devastating picture of the Ashford family's crimes and moral failures over 3 decades. There were photos of Caroline's bruises dated and documented, recordings of arguments between Thomas and Jennifer Hayes, financial records proving Christopher's embezzlement, and most painful of all, photographs of the accident scene from the night Margaret killed Daniel Cooper, images that Richard had thought were destroyed, but that Henry had apparently copied before their father could eliminate the evidence. Margaret spent 3 days going through Henry's files, barely sleeping or eating, consumed by the meticulous record he had kept of her family's sins over 30 years. And with each document she reviewed, she felt her understanding of Henry transforming from loyal servant to something more like a guardian angel who had been trying to protect them from themselves while also protecting their victims from continued harm. The files were organized chronologically and by family member, each section containing not just evidence of wrongdoing, but also Henry's handwritten notes explaining context and his own emotional reactions. And reading these notes made Margaret understand that Henry had cared about them deeply, even while being horrified by their actions, that his documentation had been motivated by love as much as by outrage. The files about Thomas's abandoned son were the most extensive, Henry having tracked the child whose name was Marcus Hayes over 22 years, from his birth in 1993 through his childhood in foster care after Jennifer's death, through his current life as a construction worker struggling with debt and unstable housing. Henry had compiled photographs taken from distance, school records obtained through unclear means, and notes about Marcus's character and circumstances, and Margaret read through this documentation feeling overwhelming guilt about this nephew she had never met, this young man who was family but who had been deliberately excluded from the Ashford world because acknowledging him would have complicated Thomas's life and damaged the family reputation. Henry's notes indicated that he had considered contacting Marcus directly multiple times, had wanted to tell him about his father and his family and the inheritance he was legally entitled to, but had been afraid that doing so while Richard was alive would result in Henry being fired and Marcus being paid off or legally intimidated into silence. Henry had apparently hoped that after Richard's death, the family would be more receptive to acknowledging Marcus, but he had watched Thomas continue to ignore his son's existence and had finally decided that documentation for potential posthumous revelation was the only way to ensure Marcus eventually learned the truth about his origins. The files about Christopher's embezzlement were complex financial records that Margaret struggled to fully understand, but Henry had included a summary written in plain language explaining that Christopher had stolen approximately $47 million from the company over 15 years through various schemes involving fake vendors and inflated contracts and money transferred to offshore accounts. Henry had documented not just the theft, but also Richard's discovery of it, and his decision to cover it up, rather than reporting Christopher to authorities or even to the company's board. And Henry's notes expressed disgust at Richard's willingness to enable crime when the criminal was his own son. But Henry had also documented what had happened after Richard's death, showing that Christopher had accelerated his theft once he no longer had to worry about his father's oversight, and that the company's current financial health was precarious, that major contracts were being fulfilled with insufficient funds, that employee pension accounts were being raided to cover Christopher's theft, and that the whole structure was likely to collapse within a few years if nothing changed. Henry had apparently tried to hint to Margaret about problems with the business, had made comments about Christopher's management that she had dismissed as the complaints of someone who didn't understand modern business practices, and now she understood he had been trying to warn her without directly violating his position as household staff. The files about Caroline's abuse were harder to review. Photographs of bruises and recordings of arguments and medical records from emergency room visits where Caroline had lied lied about how she got injured, and Margaret felt physically sick, seeing documented evidence of suffering she had witnessed peripherally but had never confronted directly. Henry's notes showed that he had repeatedly tried to encourage Caroline to leave, had offered to testify on her behalf, had even researched domestic violence resources and had left information where Caroline would find it, but that Caroline had been too afraid of Richard's disapproval and too dependent on Bradley's income to make the break. But Henry had also documented Richard's knowledge of the abuse and his response, recordings of conversations where Caroline had begged her father for help, and Richard had told her that marriage required compromise, that she needed to be less confrontational with Bradley, that divorce would damage the family reputation and would set a bad example for her children. The recordings were devastating. Margaret, hearing her father's voice calmly advising her sister to endure violence rather than seeking safety, prioritizing image over his daughter's well-being, and she understood why Henry had felt compelled to document this, to create a record that would prove Richard's moral failure and that might motivate the family to finally support Caroline if she chose to leave. The files about Margaret herself were the most painful to review. Photographs of the accident scene showing Daniel Cooper's body and the damage to Margaret's car. Recordings of conversations between Richard and the police chief where her father had clearly used his influence to redirect the investigation, and copies of the original police report before it was altered to hide Margaret's involvement. Henry had also included information about Daniel Cooper and his family, photographs of Daniel as a child and as a young man, obituary clippings, and current information about Ellen Cooper, who was living alone in subsidized housing and who volunteered at a victims advocacy center, helping other families who had lost loved ones to hit-and-run accidents. Reading about Ellen Cooper made Margaret's guilt unbearable. Understanding that this woman had dedicated her life to helping others find justice that she herself had been denied, that she had transformed her grief into service while the person responsible for her son's death had continued living in wealth and comfort. Henry's notes indicated that he had met Ellen once, had attended a victims advocacy event where she spoke, and that hearing her talk about Daniel and about the ongoing pain of not knowing what happened had convinced Henry that silence was not sustainable, that Ellen deserved truth, regardless of what that truth would cost the Ashford family. Margaret made her first decision after reviewing all the files, and she hired a private investigator to locate Marcus Hayes and to compile a complete report on his current circumstances. And when the report arrived a week later, it confirmed what Henry's documentation had suggested, that Marcus was struggling financially, was working long hours in construction, was living paycheck to paycheck, and had no idea that his biological father was a wealthy man who could have provided for him but who had chosen to pretend he didn't exist. The investigator's report also indicated that Marcus was a good person, was known for helping co-workers and neighbors, was respected despite having limited resources, and Margaret felt a fierce determination that this young man deserved to know his family and to receive some compensation for the abandonment he had suffered. She contacted a lawyer, not the family attorney who would have reported back to Christopher, but an independent attorney named Sarah Chen, who specialized in family law and inheritance disputes. And she explained the situation about Marcus and asked what legal obligations the family had and what options existed for acknowledging him now. Sarah explained that if Thomas had known about Marcus when he was born, he could have been forced to pay child support, but that statute of limitations had run on those claims, and that Marcus had no automatic right to inheritance unless he could prove paternity and unless Thomas's will specifically provided for him. But Sarah also explained that families could choose to acknowledge biological children even if not legally required, that providing financial support to Marcus now could be framed as a gift rather than an obligation, and that if Margaret wanted to help Marcus, she had significant resources to do so through trusts or direct payments that didn't require Thomas's cooperation. Margaret decided to do exactly that, to establish a trust for Marcus, funded by her own inheritance, and she asked Sarah to contact Marcus and to explain that he had family he didn't know about, that his biological father had abandoned him, but that his aunt wanted to make amends, and that substantial financial support would be available if Marcus was interested in connecting with the Ashford family. The conversation with Marcus happened 2 weeks later, Sarah facilitating a meeting at her office, and Margaret found herself face to face with a young man who looked startlingly like Thomas had looked at that age. The same bone structure and the same eyes, undeniable physical evidence of their connection. Marcus was understandably confused and skeptical, asked why this was happening now after 25 years of no contact, asked what the Ashford family wanted from him, and Margaret told him the truth, explained about Henry and the documentation and her own guilt about the family's abandonment of him, and she said she wasn't asking for anything except the chance to provide support that should have been given years ago. Marcus asked about Thomas, asked if his biological father knew about this meeting and whether he was interested in a relationship, and Margaret had to tell him the truth, that Thomas knew Marcus existed but was refusing to acknowledge him, was afraid of how acknowledgement would affect his current family and his reputation, and that Margaret was acting independently against her brother's wishes because she believed it was the right thing to do. She saw hurt flash across Marcus's face at this rejection, saw him processing the fact that his biological father didn't want to know him, and she felt fury at Thomas for being too cowardly to face his own son. But Marcus surprised her by saying he didn't need Thomas, that he had built a life without a father and didn't need one now, but that he appreciated Margaret reaching out and that he was interested in learning more about his biological family history and in accepting financial support if it was genuinely being offered without strings attached. Margaret assured him the support was real and unconditional, explained about the trust she was establishing that would provide him with regular income and would be available for education or housing or whatever he needed, and she watched Marcus's face as he processed that his financial struggles were essentially over, that this unexpected aunt was giving him resources that would transform his circumstances. They talked for 2 hours, Marcus asking questions about Jennifer and about what had happened after she died, and Margaret told him everything she knew, admitted that the family had treated his mother badly, that Thomas had refused to acknowledge the pregnancy, and that Richard had apparently created additional problems through the false drug charge, and she apologized on behalf of the family for the harm they had caused. Marcus said he remembered his mother vaguely, remembered her being sad and stressed, and that she had died when he was 5 in a car accident that he had always thought was just bad luck, but now he wondered if there had been more to it, if someone had wanted to make sure Jennifer's claims against the Ashford family disappeared permanently. Margaret felt sick at this suggestion, but couldn't dismiss it, couldn't claim with certainty that her father wouldn't have arranged something like that, and she told Marcus that Henry's documentation raised similar questions but didn't provide definitive answers, that the accident had been investigated and ruled accidental, but that the investigator had been someone with connections to Richard. She said that if Marcus wanted to pursue answers about his mother's death, she would support that, would provide resources for a private investigation, and Marcus said he would think about it. That part of him wanted to know, and part of him was afraid of what he might discover. Margaret also made a decision about Christopher's embezzlement, and she contacted a corporate attorney and explained the situation, showed him Henry's documentation, and asked what obligation she had as a minority shareholder to report the theft. The attorney explained that she had no legal obligation since she wasn't on the board and wasn't involved in management, but that ethically she should report what she knew because employees and other shareholders were being harmed by Christopher's actions, and that the longer the theft continued, the worse the eventual consequences would be when it was finally discovered. So Margaret filed a formal complaint with the company's board, submitted copies of Henry's financial documentation, and demanded an independent audit of Christopher's management and the company's accounts. Christopher reacted with rage, threatened to sue her for defamation, tried to use his position as CEO to suppress the investigation, but the board took the complaint seriously, hired forensic accountants, and within a month had confirmed that Christopher had been stealing from the company for years, and that the theft totaled over $47 million. Christopher was fired immediately, was facing criminal charges, and was desperately trying to negotiate a settlement that would allow him to repay the stolen funds in exchange for avoiding prison. The scandal was enormous, made headlines in the business press, and destroyed the Ashford family's reputation in the corporate community, and Margaret's other siblings blamed her for the public humiliation, said she had betrayed the family by exposing Christopher rather than handling it privately. But Margaret felt no guilt about this decision, felt that Henry had been right, that silence enabled continued harm, and that the employees whose pensions had been raided and the shareholders who had been deceived deserved to know the truth about who had been managing their investments. She also finally found the courage to contact Caroline and to tell her that she supported her leaving Bradley, that she would provide financial resources and legal support and housing if Caroline needed it, and that their father's opinion about divorce was irrelevant now that he was dead. Caroline cried when Margaret said this, admitted that she had been thinking about leaving for years but had been too afraid, and that knowing she had her sister's support made the idea of starting over feel possible rather than terrifying. Within a month, Caroline had filed for divorce, had moved into a property Margaret owned, and was working with therapists and lawyers to document the abuse and to ensure Bradley faced consequences for what he had done. But the hardest decision remained, the one about Daniel Cooper and what Margaret owed to his mother Ellen. And Margaret spent weeks agonizing over whether to turn herself in, consulting with lawyers about what charges she might face and what sentence she could expect, and trying to understand whether confession would actually serve justice or would just be self-serving emotional relief that accomplished nothing for Ellen Cooper. Her attorney explained that the statute of limitations for vehicular manslaughter in their state was 10 years, that technically Margaret could not be prosecuted for the accident itself, but that she could potentially be charged with obstruction of justice or conspiracy to conceal evidence, charges that carried their own prison time. The attorney also explained that voluntary confession after the statute of limitations had expired would be unusual, that most people in Margaret's position would simply stay silent and consider themselves fortunate to have avoided legal consequences, and that confession would inevitably trigger media attention and public scrutiny that would be devastating for Margaret and her family. But the attorney also said that if Margaret's primary concern was providing Ellen Cooper with answers and some form of justice, there were other ways to accomplish that beyond criminal prosecution, ways that might be more restorative and less punitive while still acknowledging the harm that had been done. Margaret decided to contact Ellen Cooper directly, to meet with her privately before making any decisions about public confession or legal consequences, and she asked Sarah Chen to arrange the meeting and to prepare Ellen for what would be a shocking and potentially traumatic conversation. Sarah called a few days later and said that Ellen had agreed to meet, that she was curious about why a member of the Ashford family wanted to speak with her, and that she would come to Sarah's office the following Tuesday with the understanding that the conversation would be confidential unless she chose to make it public. The meeting was the hardest thing Margaret had ever done, walking into that conference room and sitting across from a woman in her late 60s who had spent 15 years searching for answers about her son's death. And Margaret saw immediately that Ellen looked older than her years, worn down by grief and by the frustration of an investigation that had gone nowhere and questions that had never been answered. Sarah made brief introductions and then left them alone, and Margaret found herself looking into Ellen's tired eyes and trying to find words adequate to the confession she needed to make. She started by apologizing, by saying she was sorry for Ellen's loss and for the pain Ellen had endured, and Ellen looked confused, asked what Margaret could possibly be sorry for since they had never met, and the Ashford family had no connection to Daniel as far as Ellen knew. Margaret took a deep breath and told her the truth, explained that she had been driving drunk 15 years ago, that she had hit Daniel on the road near her family's estate, that her father had covered up the accident and had made it look like Daniel had been hit somewhere else by someone else, and that she had lived with the guilt of that silence for 15 years, while Ellen had been denied answers and justice. Ellen's face went through a series of expressions as she processed this confession: shock and disbelief, and then a fury so intense that Margaret thought the woman might physically attack her. And Ellen stood up and demanded to know if this was some kind of sick joke, if Margaret was really sitting here claiming to be responsible for Daniel's death, after all these years of Ellen searching and grieving and wondering what had happened. Margaret said it was true, that she had Henry Sullivan's documentation to prove it, and she showed Ellen some of the photographs and reports that Henry had kept, and Ellen's hands shook as she looked at the evidence, at photographs of the accident scene and of Margaret's damaged car, and of the police reports before they were altered. Ellen sat down heavily and asked why Margaret was telling her this now, why after 15 years of silence she had suddenly decided to confess. And Margaret explained about Henry's letter, about the butler who had witnessed the cover-up and had been carrying the truth for years, and had finally decided that silence was not acceptable, that Ellen deserved to know what had happened to her son. She explained that Henry had asked her to turn herself in, to give Ellen justice through legal accountability, but that the statute of limitations had expired and that criminal prosecution was no longer possible, and that she was here to tell Ellen the truth and to ask what Ellen needed, what would help her find some peace after 15 years of not knowing. Ellen cried then, deep, racking sobs that shook her whole body, and she said that knowing was worse in some ways than not knowing, that for 15 years she had been able to imagine that Daniel's death had been quick and painless, that the driver who hit him had been remorseful and scared and had run because of panic rather than callousness. But now she understood that the driver had been a wealthy woman who had been drunk and whose father had used his power to make sure she faced no consequences, and that this reality was somehow more painful than the mystery had been. Margaret let Ellen cry, felt her own tears streaming down her face, and when Ellen finally regained some composure, she asked what Margaret wanted, whether this confession was about seeking forgiveness, or about assuaging guilt, or about something else. Margaret said honestly that she wanted all of those things, but that what mattered more was what Ellen needed, that she was prepared to do whatever Ellen asked, whether that meant public confession or financial compensation or simply answering questions about that night and about Daniel's final moments, and that Ellen's needs would determine what happened next, rather than Margaret's preferences about how to manage her guilt. Ellen was quiet for a long time, staring at the photographs Henry had preserved, and finally she said that what she wanted most was for Margaret to acknowledge publicly what she had done, to tell the truth about Daniel's death so that the official record could be corrected, so that Daniel's name would be cleared of any suggestion that he had been at fault or had contributed to the accident, and so that other families dealing with unsolved hit-and-runs would understand that wealth and power could suppress truth but couldn't eliminate it forever. Ellen said she didn't necessarily want Margaret to go to prison. That punishment after all these years seemed pointless, but that she wanted Margaret's confession to be public and permanent, to be something that couldn't be denied or minimized. Margaret agreed immediately, said she would make a public statement, would provide all of Henry's documentation to law enforcement even though charges couldn't be filed, would do whatever was necessary to ensure the truth was part of the public record. Ellen also said she wanted Margaret to fund a scholarship in Daniel's name, to create something positive from this tragedy that would help young people from working-class backgrounds get education and opportunities that Daniel never had the chance to pursue. And Margaret said she would establish the scholarship immediately, would fund it generously from her own inheritance, evidence and would make sure Daniel's name was honored through helping others. Ellen asked one more question, asked whether Richard Ashford had also been involved in the cover-up or whether it had been entirely Margaret's doing, and Margaret explained that her father had orchestrated everything, had moved evidence, and had used his connections to redirect the investigation, and that she had been too shocked and too cowardly to stop him, had simply let him manage the situation while she retreated into denial. Ellen nodded slowly and said that explained a lot, that she had always wondered why the investigation had been so incompetent, why obvious leads hadn't been followed, and now she understood that it hadn't been incompetence but deliberate suppression, wealthy people using their power to protect themselves at the expense of justice for ordinary people. The meeting ended with Ellen saying she needed time to process everything, that learning the truth after 15 years was overwhelming, and that she couldn't make immediate decisions about what came next, but that she was glad Margaret had come forward, that knowing was better than the alternative, even though the knowing hurt terribly. Margaret gave Ellen her contact information and told her to reach out whenever she was ready to talk more, and as she left Sarah's office, she felt simultaneously devastated and relieved, crushed by Ellen's pain, but also grateful to finally have told the truth to the person who deserved it most. Margaret made her public confession 2 weeks later, releasing a detailed statement through her attorney that explained what had happened in 2008, acknowledged her guilt, described her father's cover-up, and apologized to Ellen Cooper and to the community for 15 years of lying and hiding. The statement was picked up by every media outlet, created massive headlines about the Ashford family and their crimes, and resulted in calls for investigation even though criminal charges were no longer possible. Margaret gave interviews where she discussed her guilt and her gratitude to Henry Sullivan for forcing her to confront what she had done, and she established the Daniel Cooper Memorial Scholarship with an initial endowment of $2 million, creating a permanent reminder of the young man whose life she had taken. The public reaction was mixed, some people expressing admiration for Margaret's willingness to confess even after the statute of limitations had expired, others saying that confession without legal consequences was meaningless, that wealthy people could always buy their way out of accountability through delayed admissions of guilt. Margaret accepted both responses, understood that nothing she did could truly make amends for killing Daniel, but felt that Henry had been right, that silence was its own form of continued harm, that speaking truth, even when it destroyed her reputation, was the minimum moral obligation she owed to Daniel's memory and to Ellen's grief. Her relationship with Thomas deteriorated completely after her public confessions about the family's crimes, Thomas refusing to speak to her and threatening legal action if she revealed anything more about his past or about Marcus Hayes. But Margaret had already told Marcus everything she knew, had already established the trust that would provide for him financially, and she felt no obligation to protect Thomas's secrets when Thomas had shown no remorse about abandoning his son or about Jennifer Hayes's suspicious death. Christopher was too consumed with his own legal problems to worry about Margaret's confessions, was facing multiple felony charges, and was trying to negotiate a plea deal that would minimize his prison time. Only Caroline supported Margaret's decisions, told her that she was brave to tell the truth about Daniel Cooper, and that watching Margaret face consequences for her actions had given Caroline courage to be honest about her own life, to stop pretending her marriage had been acceptable just because it had been legal, to acknowledge that abuse was abuse, regardless of whether the abuser wore an expensive suit and had wealthy friends. Caroline's divorce had become public and contentious, Bradley fighting her on every point and using his connections to try to make the process as painful as possible. But Caroline had Henry's documentation of the abuse and had her own courage, and she was determined to get free, regardless of how difficult Bradley made it. 6 months after making her public confession, Margaret received a letter from Ellen Cooper, the first direct communication since their meeting at Sarah's office, and Ellen wrote that she had needed time to process everything, to work through her anger and her grief with a therapist, and that she wanted Margaret to know that she didn't forgive her, that forgiveness wasn't something Ellen could offer, but that she appreciated Margaret telling the truth and that knowing what had happened to Daniel had allowed her to finally begin healing from 15 years of not knowing. Ellen wrote that she was involved now with the scholarship fund, was helping to select recipients, and was meeting the students who were being supported in Daniel's name, and that this connection to her son's memory was helping her transform her grief into something that served others. The letter concluded with Ellen writing that Henry Sullivan must have been an extraordinary person to have documented all of this, to have carried these secrets for 30 years, and to have found a way to force the Ashford family to confront their crimes even after his death, and that Ellen wished she could have met Henry and thanked him for caring enough about justice to spend 3 decades collecting evidence that he knew would eventually expose the people who employed him. Ellen said she thought Henry must have loved the Ashford family in complicated ways, must have seen potential in them that they hadn't seen in themselves, and that his final act had been an attempt to save them from becoming the kind of people who could live comfortably with the harms they had caused. 2 years after Henry's death, Margaret stood in the memorial garden she had created on the Ashford estate, a quiet space dedicated to Henry Sullivan's memory and to the victims of the family's crimes, and she thought about the butler who had served them faithfully while secretly documenting their failures, who had loved them enough to try to save them, even knowing that salvation would require destroying the comfortable lies they had built their lives around. The garden was simple but beautiful, designed by a landscape architect Margaret had hired, but inspired by her own memories of Henry's preferences, the flowers he had liked, and the trees he had admired during his rare moments of leisure on the estate grounds. There was a bench in the center of the garden with a plaque that read, "Henry Sullivan, 1948 to 2023, a man who served truth more faithfully than he served any family." And Margaret came here often to sit and think about the ways her life had changed since reading Henry's letter, about the person she had been and the person she was trying to become. The estate itself was smaller now, most of the property having been sold to pay for Christopher's restitution to the company and to fund the various settlements and scholarships Margaret had established, but the remaining 5 acres felt more peaceful than the original 10 ever had, felt like a space where honesty was possible, rather than a stage where performances of wealth and respectability had to be constantly maintained. Marcus Hayes visited occasionally, this nephew who had been denied his place in the family for 25 years and who was now cautiously building relationships with the relatives who had failed him. He had used the trust Margaret established to go back to school, was studying architecture with plans to design affordable housing, and he told Margaret that knowing where he came from had been painful but also liberating, had given him answers to questions that had haunted him his entire life. Thomas had never contacted Marcus, had maintained his refusal to acknowledge his son even after the truth became public, and Marcus had made peace with this rejection, had decided that he didn't need Thomas's approval or affection when he had other family members who genuinely wanted to know him. Caroline lived in a smaller house on the remaining estate property, having finally gotten free of Bradley after a brutal divorce that had taken 18 months and had cost both of them substantial sums in legal fees. She was working now, had taken a job at a non-profit supporting domestic violence survivors, and she told Margaret that helping other women escape the kind of situation she had endured gave her purpose in ways that her previous life of charity galas and country club lunches never had. Caroline's children had struggled with their parents' divorce and with the public revelations about their grandfather's cover-up of abuse, but Caroline was determined to raise them with different values than she had been raised with, to teach them that honesty and compassion mattered more than reputation, and that admitting mistakes was stronger than hiding them. Christopher was in federal prison, serving a 6-year sentence for embezzlement and securities fraud, having accepted a plea deal after the evidence Henry had compiled proved impossible to dispute. Margaret visited him occasionally, uncomfortable meetings where Christopher alternated between blaming her for his incarceration and expressing grudging respect for her willingness to blow up the family rather than continuing the cover-ups their father had normalized. Christopher claimed he was using his time in prison to reflect on his choices, to understand how he had become someone capable of stealing from his own company. But Margaret suspected he was mostly angry about being caught and was already planning how to rebuild his image once he was released. Thomas had moved to another state, had essentially fled the public scrutiny that had followed the revelations about his abandoned son and about the suspicious circumstances of Jennifer Hayes's death. No charges had been filed in Jennifer's death. The evidence was circumstantial and the statute of limitations had expired, but the media coverage had been devastating, had portrayed Thomas as a coward who had let the mother of his child die without ever acknowledging his responsibility. His current wife had nearly left him over the revelations. His legitimate children were struggling with the knowledge that they had a half-brother their father had refused to acknowledge, and Thomas's business ventures had suffered as clients and partners distanced themselves from the scandal. Margaret herself had become something of a public figure, not celebrated exactly, but discussed, a wealthy woman who had chosen confession and accountability over continued comfort, and she gave occasional interviews about her experience, about living with hidden guilt, and about the relief and pain that came from finally telling truth. She had established a foundation in Henry's name that funded programs supporting whistleblowers and domestic workers, recognizing that people in service positions often witnessed crimes and abuses but lacked power to report them without risking their livelihoods. And she worked to create protections and resources for people who chose to speak up despite the personal costs. The Daniel Cooper Memorial Scholarship had supported 15 students so far, young people from working-class backgrounds who were pursuing education in fields that served their communities, and Margaret attended every scholarship ceremony, meeting the recipients and telling them about Daniel, keeping his memory alive in ways that she hoped honored both him and Ellen. Ellen Cooper had become involved with the foundation as well, serving on the board and helping to select scholarship recipients. And while she and Margaret could not be called friends exactly, they had developed a relationship based on shared commitment to preventing other families from experiencing the kind of loss and injustice that had defined Ellen's life. Margaret had also created an archive of Henry's documentation, working with historians and legal scholars to preserve the evidence he had collected, and the archive was housed at a local university where it was available to researchers studying how wealth enabled crime and how cover-ups functioned in elite families. The archive included not just the documents about the Ashford family, but also Henry's personal journals that Margaret had found among his effects, decades of observations about the families he had served and the patterns he had witnessed, and these journals were proving valuable to people studying domestic service and class relations and the ways that extreme wealth corrupted moral judgment. Reading Henry's journals had given Margaret insight into the man who had served her family for 30 years, and she learned that he had been more complicated than she had ever understood, that he had genuine affection for them, mixed with frustration and disappointment, that he had struggled constantly with the question of when silence became complicity and when speaking up became betrayal. Henry had written about watching the Ashford children grow up, had recorded his hopes that they would be better than their parents, and his gradual realization that wealth and privilege were reproducing themselves, that Christopher and Thomas and even Caroline and Margaret were learning to prioritize image over integrity just as Richard had taught them. But Henry had also written about moments of hope, times when one of the children showed compassion or honesty or moral courage, and Margaret was moved to discover that Henry had believed in her specifically, had thought she had more capacity for growth and change than her siblings, had hoped that eventually she would find the strength to break from family patterns and to choose differently. Reading this made Margaret cry because Henry had been right. She had found that strength, but only after he died, only after his final act act had forced her to confront truths she had been avoiding, and she wished desperately that she could tell him that his faith in her had been justified, that his documentation had not been in vain. On the second anniversary of Henry's death, Margaret organized a memorial service in the garden, inviting the small group of people who had known Henry and who had been affected by his final act of documentation. Ellen Cooper came, and Marcus Hayes, and Caroline with her children, and several of Henry's friends from his parish and from the other families he had worked for over the years. They shared stories about Henry, about his kindness and his dry humor, and his absolute commitment to doing work excellently even when no one was watching. And Margaret spoke about what Henry's courage had meant for her family, how his refusal to stay silent had forced them all to become more honest and more accountable than they would have been otherwise. She also spoke about the cost of Henry's choice, acknowledged that documenting the family's crimes for 30 years while continuing to serve them must have been exhausting and ethically complicated, that Henry had sacrificed his own peace of mind to bear witness to truths that needed recording, and that this sacrifice deserved recognition and gratitude. Margaret said that Henry had understood something that the Ashford family had forgotten, which was that service could mean many things, that being faithful to employers sometimes required being more faithful to larger principles like justice and truth, and that the highest form of loyalty was not silence in the face of wrongdoing, but courage to expose it even at personal cost. After the service, as people were leaving, Ellen Cooper approached Margaret and handed her an envelope, and inside was a letter that Ellen had found recently among Daniel's belongings, a letter he had written but never sent to a girlfriend he had been dating before his death. The letter was ordinary, talking about work and plans for the future and hopes for buying a house someday, and Ellen said she was giving it to Margaret not to cause more pain, but because she thought Margaret should understand who Daniel had been beyond the victim of a hit and run, should know him as a person with dreams and relationships and a future that had been stolen from him. Margaret read the letter through tears and thanked Ellen for sharing it, and Ellen said that she had been thinking about forgiveness, that she still couldn't offer it, but that she understood better now that Margaret had been young and stupid rather than malicious, that Richard Ashford had been the true villain in covering up the crime, and that Margaret's genuine remorse and her efforts to make amends had helped Ellen begin to heal in ways she hadn't expected. Ellen said that Henry had been right to document everything, that without his evidence Margaret would probably never have confessed, and Ellen would have died without ever knowing what happened to her son, and that she considered Henry to be a guardian angel who had watched over Daniel's memory when no one else would. As evening fell and the memorial garden emptied, Margaret sat alone on the bench dedicated to Henry's memory, and she thought about the journey from the person she had been 2 years ago, living with hidden guilt and avoiding truth, to the person she was now, stripped of comfortable lies, but also freed from the weight of carrying secrets. The Ashford family reputation was destroyed, the fortune was diminished, the relationships between siblings were strained or broken, but Margaret felt more at peace than she had in years, because she was finally living honestly, finally acknowledging harm and trying to repair it, rather than hiding behind wealth and privilege. She spoke aloud to Henry even though he wasn't there to hear her, thanked him for loving them enough to try to save them, thanked him for having the courage to document truths they wanted hidden, thanked him for serving truth more faithfully than he had served their comfort, and she promised that she would continue the work he had started, would keep telling truth and supporting others who chose honesty over convenience, would make sure that his 30 years of silent witness had resulted in actual change rather than just temporary discomfort that the family would eventually overcome. The night grew cold, and stars emerged above the memorial garden, and Margaret thought about Daniel Cooper and Jennifer Hayes and all the other people who had been harmed by Ashford family crimes, and she thought about Henry Sullivan, who had seen everything and had recorded everything and had finally forced accountability, even though it cost him nothing since he was already dead. And she understood that this was what legacy meant, not the buildings or the money, or the reputation you left behind, but the truth you told, and the changes you inspired, and the people you helped even when helping them, required destroying yourself. And sitting in that garden with Henry's name on the bench beside her, and the estate she had grown up on, transformed from monument to wealth into something smaller and more honest, Margaret felt grateful for the butler who had served them for 30 years, and who had loved them enough to refuse to let their crimes stay buried. And she knew that everything good she accomplished from this point forward would be built on the foundation of truth that Henry had forced her to stand on, even when standing on truth felt like standing on broken glass, because the alternative was standing on lies that would eventually collapse beneath the weight of their own corruption. Before you go, tell me in the comments, do you think the butler was a hero for exposing the family's secrets, or did he betray their trust after 30 years of service? And subscribe to this channel, because every week we uncover stories where hidden truths change everything, and I want you here for every revelation.